the buzzing TNT studio in Atlanta, a soft-spoken martial arts icon was about to face down a giant who didn't know he'd crossed a line. What began as playful playoff night teasing turned deadly serious when Shaquille O'Neal and the fired-up arena crowd pressed Chuck Norris to show his moves on live television. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical celebrity guest talking sports psychology. For over 50 years, he'd been a special forces instructor, champion fighter, and silent architect of real-world discipline. Known for ending threats before anyone realized they'd begun. So, when Shaquille O'Neal stood over him, shadowboxing and taunting his size, the studio had no idea they were facing a man trained to turn tension into weaponry. Chuck simply rose, shifted his stance, and dismantled the 7-foot legend, not with violence, but with presence, triggering a chain reaction of fear, silence, and revelation. What began as a harmless joke on the biggest sports show on TV would become a televised transformation, where ego cracked, respect was reclaimed, and millions watched Shaq learn what real power looks like. The Atlanta broadcast floor would never forget the moment Chuck Norris proved that the smallest movement can shatter the largest man's confidence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The TNT studio hummed with its familiar energy on this Thursday night in Atlanta. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the adjacent fan arena pulsed with thousands of playoff-hungry voices, their chants bleeding through the soundproof glass like distant thunder. Inside, under the bright studio lights, 4 legends sat around the iconic desk that had become basketball's most beloved living room. Welcome back to Inside the NBA. Ernie Johnson's voice carried its usual warmth as he addressed the cameras. We're live from Atlanta with our playoff coverage, and tonight we have a very special guest joining us. His smile widened as he gestured toward the 5th chair. Ladies and gentlemen, martial arts legend and actor Chuck Norris is here to talk about mental discipline in high-pressure sports. The arena crowd's roar penetrated the studio walls as Chuck raised a modest hand in acknowledgement. At 78, he remained sharp-eyed and composed, wearing a simple black polo that somehow made him look more formidable than any flashy outfit could. His presence carried a quiet weight that seemed to settle over the normally boisterous desk like morning fog. Shaquille O'Neal, massive even by NBA standards, leaned back in his chair with characteristic ease. At 7'1" and 300 lb, Shaq had spent decades being the biggest presence in any room. His infectious grin spread across his face as he studied their guest with theatrical curiosity. Chuck Norris Shaq's booming voice filled the studio. Man, I used to watch your movies when I was a kid. Walker, Texas, Ranger was the truth. He gestured broadly, his gold rings catching the studio lights. But real talk, you're smaller than I expected. I mean, you're what, maybe 5 to 10? Kenny Smith burst into laughter from beside him, his energy instantly amplifying Shaq's playful mood. 510 might be generous, Shaq. Chuck, you sure you didn't use camera tricks to look bigger in those fight scenes? Charles Barkley, never one to miss an opportunity for humor, chimed in with his trademark Alabama draw. Y'all are terrible. The man's a legitimate martial artist. Show some respect. But his eyes twinkled with mischief as he added, though I got to say, Chuck, standing next to Shaq, you do look like somebody's little brother. The studio erupted in laughter from the crew behind the cameras. Maya Torres, the floor director, shook her head with amusement from her position near the control monitors, her headset crackling with directions from the production truck. She'd seen hundreds of these playful moments over the years. The chemistry between these 4 men was pure television gold. Chuck's response was a gentle smile. but something in his stillness caught Ernie's attention. The veteran host had developed sharp instincts over decades of managing personalities, and he sensed a subtle shift in the room's energy. Chuck wasn't laughing along with the joke. "Well, Chuck," Ernie interjected smoothly, trying to guide the conversation towards safer ground. "Tell us about how mental discipline translates from martial arts to basketball. These guys deal with incredible pressure in the playoffs." But Shaq was riding the wave of laughter, feeding off Kenny's encouragement and the distant roar of fans who could see the broadcast on arena monitors. "Nah, Ernie, I'm curious about this, Chuck. You really think you could take on somebody my size? Like, what's your strategy when you're giving up a foot in 150 reps?" The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. Kenny's laughter began to fade as he noticed Chuck's expression hadn't changed. Still calm, still observant, but with something deeper stirring behind his eyes. Barkley, whose street-smart instincts had served him well both on and off the court, leaned slightly forward, suddenly more interested in Chuck's response than the joke. Young Devin Brooks, operating camera 2, instinctively tightened his shot on Chuck's face. Fresh out of film school and barely 23, he'd grown up watching action movies and had an almost supernatural sense for dramatic moments. Something in Chuck's controlled stillness told him to keep rolling. "Discipline," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying a conversational tone that somehow commanded attention, "isn't about size." He paused, his gaze moving slowly from Shaq to the other analysts. "It's about understanding that real strength comes from knowing when not to use it." The arena crowd watching on massive screens began to stir with interest. Chants of "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck" started filtering through the glass, adding an unexpected soundtrack to what had begun as simple studio banter. Maya felt her first flutter of concern. The show's rhythm was shifting away from their planned segments, and she could sense something brewing that wasn't in the script. But the cameras were rolling. Millions were watching, and sometimes live television took on a life of its own. Kenny tried to lighten the mood. "Chuck's getting all philosophical on us. Shaq, I think you awakened the sensei." But Shaq's competitive instincts, honed through decades of athletic dominance, detected something in Chuck's response that felt like a challenge rather than philosophy. His grin widened, but his posture straightened. "Come on, Chuck, that's movie talk. You know what I'm saying? In real life, when push comes to shove, size matters. Physics, baby." Chuck nodded slowly, as if considering the point with genuine interest. "You're absolutely right about physics," he said. "Force equals mass times acceleration. But there are other laws at work, too." The way he said it, not confrontational, not defensive, just matter of fact, sent an almost imperceptible chill through the studio. Barclay's comedian instinct suddenly told him to tread carefully. Ernie's hand moved unconsciously toward his notes, preparing to transition to a safer topic. But it was too late. The moment had taken on its own momentum, like a playoff game, where the energy shifted and both teams could feel something bigger building. Through the glass walls, the arena crowd's chants grew louder, their excitement palpable as they sensed drama unfolding. Devin kept his camera steady on Chuck, watching the martial artist's hands remain perfectly still on the desk, while his eyes never left Shaq's face. In film school, they'd talked about tension you could cut with a knife. This was something different tension that seemed to thicken the very air in the room. Maya checked the commercial break schedule. 3 minutes until they could cut away. But 3 minutes in, live television could feel like an eternity when the atmosphere began to crackle with unscripted electricity. "And we're clear for commercial," Maya announced through her headset. her voice carrying a note of relief that she tried to mask with professional efficiency. The red recording lights dimmed across the studio like sunset, and the familiar hum of television production temporarily shifted into its lower gear. But instead of the usual relaxed chatter that filled commercial breaks, the easy banter between analysts, crew members adjusting equipment, the comfortable rhythm of people who had worked together for years, an unusual tension lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire. The studio's atmosphere had changed in ways that everyone could feel, but nobody quite understood. The bright lights seemed harsher somehow, casting shadows that hadn't been there before. The familiar space that had hosted thousands of comfortable conversations suddenly felt smaller, more confined, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Shaq pushed back from the desk with his characteristic laugh. The sound that had charmed audiences for years and smoothed over countless awkward moments. But tonight, it sounded forced even to him, echoing strangely in the studio space, as if the acoustics had somehow changed during the broadcast. His massive frame unfolded from the chair with the fluid athleticism that had made him a basketball legend. But there was something performative about the movement now. Something that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that everything was normal. "Chuck, man, don't take it personal," Shaq said, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. "We just messing with you. That's how we do it here. We joke around with everybody." The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly might retroactively make them true. He stood up to his full imposing height, his 7'1" frame casting a shadow across the studio floor that seemed to stretch further than physics should allow. With exaggerated playfulness, he raised his hands in a mock boxing stance, throwing slow-motion punches toward Chuck with the kind of theatrical movement that usually generated laughs from crew members and guests alike. "Look at this reach, though," Shaq called out, his voice echoing slightly in the studio space. "My arm span is probably longer than you are tall." He shadow-boxed more enthusiastically, his movements growing more elaborate as he tried to inject levity into an atmosphere that seemed increasingly resistant to humor. The studio crew responded with chuckles, but they sounded nervous, uncertain the kind of laughter that people produce when they're not sure if something is funny or dangerous. Camera operators glanced at each other with raised eyebrows. Sound technicians adjusted their headphones as if trying to hear something beyond the obvious. Production assistants found excuses to busy themselves with equipment that didn't need adjustment. But Chuck remained seated, perfectly still. His presence somehow more commanding in stillness than Shaq's was in motion. His hands rested calmly on the desk, fingers relaxed, but somehow purposeful, as if they were consciously choosing to remain still rather than simply being at rest. He didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't react to Shaq's performance at all, just observed with an intensity that seemed to absorb and evaluate every movement, every word, every gesture. The quality of Chuck's attention was unnerving in its completeness. He watched Shaq's shadowboxing display with the focused observation of someone studying a very interesting specimen under a microscope. Not judgmental, not threatening, just utterly present and aware in a way that made everyone else in the studio acutely conscious of being watched in return. Kenny felt his laughter die in his throat, like a candle flame snuffed by sudden wind. Something about something. Chuck's complete lack of reaction unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. When someone joked around, the normal response was to laugh, to joke back, to play along with the established rhythm of television banter. You didn't just watch like you were studying, like you were calculating variables in an equation that nobody else could see. "Yo, Chuck." Kenny tried again, his voice higher than usual and carrying a note of forced joviality that everyone could hear. "You gonna show us some moves or what? Break out some of that karate action." The words came out with the desperate energy of someone trying to restart a stalled engine, pushing harder on the accelerator when what was needed was a completely different approach. Barclay's instincts kicked in like a smoke alarm, responding to the first hint of fire. His street-smart awareness honed through years of pickup games and late-night confrontations outside clubs recognized the signs of a situation shifting from playful to potentially dangerous. He'd seen this before, the moment when somebody who'd been quiet too long was about to stop being quiet, when patient observation transformed into something more active and potentially problematic. "Shaq," Barkley said quietly, his voice carrying a note of caution that cut through the forced levity like a knife through fabric. "Maybe we should." "Nah, Charles. It's all good," Shaq interrupted. But his shadow boxing had become more aggressive, more insistent, his movements losing their theatrical quality and taking on the edge of genuine frustration. The crowd's energy from beyond the glass walls was feeding something in him. Pride, competitiveness, the desperate need to maintain his image as the dominant presence in any room he entered. Chuck knows where. Just having fun. Right, Chuck. The question hung in the air with unexpected weight, demanding a response that Chuck seemed in no hurry to provide. His silence had become an active force in the room, more powerful than any words could have been. The martial artist's complete stillness created a vacuum that seemed to suck the energy out of Shaq's performance, making each shadow-boxed punch look more desperate and less convincing. Behind camera, too, Devin felt his pulse quicken as his professional instincts recognized the shift in energy. His finger hovered over the record button for his personal behind-the-scenes footage. The kind of content that sometimes went viral online that could make careers or destroy them depending on what it captured. Something told him this wasn't just fun anymore, if it ever had been. The air itself felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Through the studio's floor to ceiling glass walls, the arena crowd had grown louder, their voices penetrating the supposedly soundproof barrier like water finding cracks in a dam. They could see the interaction on their monitors, and thousands of voices began coalescing into a rhythmic chant that seemed to pulse through the building's very foundations. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. The sound was primal, insistent, adding pressure to an already charged atmosphere like steam building in a boiler. Maya checked her watch with growing anxiety. 2 minutes until they went live again. She directed hundreds of broadcasts, managed countless personalities, but she'd never felt this particular kind of tension. It wasn't the fun chaos of Shaq and Barkley arguing about basketball statistics or Kenny's latest theory about player development. This felt real in a way that made her stomach clench with professional concern. The production truck was buzzing in her earpiece, voices overlapping as assistant directors, producers, and network executives all tried to make sense of what they were seeing through their monitors. "What's happening down there?" one voice demanded. "Should we extend the commercial break?" asked another. "This could be good television," suggested a third. Though uncertainty colored every word, Chuck slowly turned his head toward the arena noise filtering through the glass, then back to Shaq, with the deliberate movement of someone who missed nothing and forgot less. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same conversational tone as before, but underneath it ran something deeper, like still water flowing over bedrock, calm on the surface, but carrying immense power beneath. "You know, Shaq," Chuck said, rising from his chair with fluid, economical movement that somehow seemed to change the dimensions of the entire studio. "In my experience, The loudest person in the room usually isn't the strongest. The words hit the studio like a physical blow, not because of any aggression in their delivery, but because of their complete absence of defense or justification. The statement was delivered as simple observation, the kind of truth that requires no argument because it carries its own evidence. The studio went dead, quiet. Even the crowd noise from the arena seemed to fade for a moment, as if 20,000 people had somehow sensed the shift in energy through the glass walls that separated them from the unfolding drama. Shaq's hands dropped to his sides, like weights suddenly cut from their strings. He watched Chuck stand with a growing realization that he was witnessing something he didn't fully understand. At 5'10", the martial artist looked almost diminutive next to the NBA legend's massive frame. But somehow his presence seemed to expand rather than shrink as he rose. The space around him felt charged, electric, like the air before a lightning strike. "Oh, we got a problem now," Barkley muttered under his breath, unconsciously scooting his chair back several inches from the potential blast zone. His comedian's timing told him this was the moment to make a joke, to diffuse the tension with humor, the way he'd done countless times before. But his survival instincts, sharpened by years of navigating dangerous situations both on and off basketball courts, told him to shut up and stay out of the way. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ernie stepped forward slightly, his decades of broadcasting experience screaming warnings through every nerve in his professional body. He could feel the show slipping away from his control, transforming from scripted sports entertainment into something raw and unpredictable. "Guys, we go live in 90 seconds. Maybe we should." But Shaq's pride, cultivated through a lifetime of physical dominance and public adoration, wouldn't allow him to back down in front of cameras and crew. The arena crowd's chants seemed to mock his uncertainty, and he could feel the studio's energy shifting away from his control like sand through his fingers. Every instinct built through decades of athletic competition told him to reassert his dominance, to reclaim his position as the alpha presence in the room. "Chuck, you standing up supposed to intimidate me or something?" Shaq said, his voice carrying forced confidence that rang hollow against the studio's changed atmosphere. "I respect what you do, man, but come on, this is real life, not the movies." The words came out with the brittle bravado of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Chuck took a single step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening. Just a simple step that somehow changed everything in the room like a stone dropped in still water. The movement was so controlled, so precise, that it seemed to ripple outward through the studio, affecting everyone present in ways they couldn't fully articulate. Devin's camera trembled slightly in his hands as he captured the moment, his film school training wearing with his human instincts. He'd studied cinematography for 4 years, analyzed thousands of hours of footage, written papers on dramatic tension and visual storytelling. But no classroom had prepared him for this kind of real-world intensity. This wasn't acting. This wasn't scripted drama. This was something primal happening between two men, and he was documenting it in real time. 60 seconds, Maya called out. But her voice sounded distant and irrelevant against the weight of what was unfolding on her set. The normal rhythms of television production felt meaningless in the face of human drama that refused to conform to commercial breaks and program schedules. Kenny had gone completely silent, his usual boisterous energy replaced by wide-eyed fascination mixed with growing concern. He looked between Shaq and Chuck like a spectator at a tennis match. Except this game was being played with forces he didn't understand and rules that nobody had explained to him. The arena crowd sensed the shift too, their collective intelligence somehow picking up on emotional frequencies that penetrated glass and steel. Their chants grew more intense, more focused. 20,000 voices creating a pressure cooker that pushed against the studio's walls. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. The rhythm was hypnotic, insistent, adding supernatural urgency to an already surreal situation. Shaq tried to laugh again, but the sound came out hollow, forced, like someone trying to whistle while walking past a graveyard. "What's happening here, man? You're trying to stare me down. I'm 7-1, 300 LOB. I've been in NBA fights with guys who could bench press trucks. You think I'm scared?" The questions tumbled out with increasing desperation, each one revealing more uncertainty than confidence. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Shaq found himself in a situation where his usual advantages felt suddenly irrelevant, where the rules he understood no longer seemed to apply. Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his stance almost imperceptibly, a shift of weight so subtle that only someone with trained eyes would notice, but one that everyone in the studio felt like a change in air pressure. The adjustment was minimal, perhaps a 6-inch shift in foot position, a barely perceptible redistribution of balance, but its effect rippled through the room like a seismic tremor. 30 seconds to live. Maya's voice cracked slightly on the announcement, betraying the professional calm she was struggling to maintain. "Chuck," Ernie said carefully, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone trying to negotiate a ceasefire. "Maybe we should all take a step back here," but Chuck's eyes never left Shaq's face, holding the younger man's gaze with a kind of steady attention that made looking away feel like surrender. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet enough that the microphones barely picked them up, but they cut through the studio noise like a blade through silk. "I'm not here to intimidate anyone, Shaq. But respect goes both ways." The statement carried no threat, no challenge, just a simple truth delivered with the quiet conviction of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. But its impact was immediate and undeniable, settling over the studio like a blanket that muffled all other sound. The commercial break countdown hit 10 seconds, and Maya realized with growing horror that they were about to go live with whatever this was. There was no time to separate them, no time to reset the energy, no time to pretend this tension didn't exist. In 10 seconds, millions of viewers would be witnessing whatever came next, and she had absolutely no idea what that might be. As the red lights flickered back to life and America tuned in for the second segment, the TNT studio had transformed from basketball's most beloved clubhouse into something else. Entirely a stage where two different kinds of power were about to collide in front of the entire world, with no script, no director, and no guarantee that anyone involved fully understood what they had set in motion. "Welcome back to Inside the NBA," Ernie announced, his professional smile masking the tension that had built during commercial. The words came out with practiced smoothness, but anyone watching closely could see the subtle tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders held just a fraction more tension than usual. "We're here with our special guest, Chuck Norris, discussing mental toughness in sports." But the carefully scripted return felt hollow, like actors trying to perform a play after the theater had caught fire. The arena crowd's chants penetrated the studio like distant thunder, and the atmosphere crackled with unresolved electricity from the previous exchange. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, 20,000 silhouettes could be seen pressed against the glass of the adjacent viewing arena, their faces illuminated by the glow of massive screens showing the live broadcast. Shaq sat rigidly in his chair, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by something harder, more defensive. The easy smile that had charmed audiences for decades looked forced now, like a mask he was struggling to keep in place. His massive hands rested on the desk, but his fingers drummed an unconscious rhythm against the polished surface, the only outward sign of the internal pressure building within him. Chuck had returned to his seat during the commercial break, but his posture remained alert, coiled like a spring at rest, but ready to respond. His hands lay perfectly still on the desk, a stark contrast to Shaq's restless energy. The martial artist's eyes moved slowly around the studio, taking in every detail: camera positions, crew movements, exit routes, with the automatic assessment of someone whose survival had once depended on such awareness. "You know what, Chuck?" Shaq said suddenly, his voice cutting across Ernie's attempt to steer toward basketball analysis. The words came out with forced casualness, but they carried an edge that everyone in the studio immediately recognized. "I've been thinking about what you said during the break." His tone was that of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. About respect, going both ways and all that. Maya's heart sank as she watched from behind the cameras, her headset crackling with increasingly frantic directions from the production truck. The network executives were watching live, and she could practically feel their panic through the airwaves. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't planned. But they were live in front of millions, and she was powerless to stop whatever Shaq was about to do. Behind camera 2, young Devin Brooks felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the shift in energy. His film school training had taught him to identify dramatic moments. But this felt different, raw, more authentic than any scripted confrontation. His finger hovered over the zoom control, instinctively preparing to capture whatever was about to unfold. "Maybe you could show us some of that real martial arts," Shaq continued, leaning forward with theatrical interest that fooled no one. The studio lights caught the perspiration beginning to form on his forehead, betraying the anxiety beneath his performance. "Not the movie stuff, real technique. Help me understand how size doesn't matter, like you said." The request landed like a gauntlet thrown at medieval court, and everyone in the studio knew it. The casual words carried the weight of challenge, pride, and something approaching desperation. Shaq was backed into a corner of his own making, and his only way forward was to double down. Kenny's eyes widened as he sensed the trap Shaq was setting, not just for Chuck, but potentially for himself. The energetic analyst, who usually fed off confrontation, suddenly found himself wishing he could disappear into his chair. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again as he realized there were no words that could diffuse what was building. Barkley muttered something under his breath that the microphones mercifully didn't catch, but his body language spoke volumes. The man, who had never backed down from anyone during his playing career, was unconsciously scooting his chair away from the potential blast zone. His comedian's instincts told him this was the moment for a joke, but his survival instincts screamed at him to stay silent. Through the glass walls, the arena crowd erupted. They could sense the confrontation building through the massive screens that showed every detail of the studio interaction, and their excitement reached fever pitch. The chants shifted into something more intense, more demanding. "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck." The rhythm pounded against the studio like a war drum, amplifying the pressure on both men and making retreat impossible for either. Chuck studied Shaq for a long moment, his expression unreadable as a master chess player contemplating his opponent's move. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Then, with the same fluid movement he displayed during commercial, Chuck stood. But this time, millions of viewers watched it happen in real time. The motion was neither rushed nor theatrical, just a simple rising from a chair that somehow carried the weight of impending storm clouds. Devon's camera captured every detail. The way Chuck's movement seemed effortless, yet purposeful. The subtle shift in his weight distribution from seated to standing. The complete absence of wasted motion. His hands hung naturally at his sides, not clenched into fists, not raised defensively, but somehow radiating readiness. In film school, they talked about how great actors could command the screen through presence alone. But this wasn't acting. "Chuck," Ernie said quickly, his broadcaster's instincts screaming warnings as he tried to regain control of his show. "You don't have to." "It's fine, Ernie." Chuck's voice remained calm, conversational, carrying no trace of anger or aggression. But as he spoke, he began moving around the desk with measured steps. Not toward Shaq directly, but in a slow arc that seemed to contract the space between them without appearing confrontational. The movement was hypnotic in its control. Chuck covered perhaps 10 feet of studio floor, but somehow his presence seemed to expand exponentially with each step. The studio cameras followed his movement automatically, their operators drawn by instincts honed through years of covering dramatic moments. Maya watched through her monitors as the ratings spiked in real time. Social media was exploding with live commentary, and her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from network executives. But she found herself mesmerized by what was unfolding on her set, unable to look away despite her growing anxiety about where it might lead. Across America, millions of viewers leaned forward in their chairs. In sports bars, conversations died mid-sentence. In living rooms, families gathered around television screens. Something was happening that transcended normal entertainment. This was human drama at its most raw and authentic. "See, that's what I'm talking about," Shaq said, but his voice had lost some of its bravado. The words came out slightly strained, like someone trying to maintain confidence while walking across a frozen lake that might crack at any moment. "You move like you know something we don't." He stood as well, his massive frame towering over Chuck by more than a foot. The size difference stark and undeniable, but at the end of the day, it's still physics, right? The crowd in the arena had gone wild. Their chants evolved into something primal, feeding off the tension they could see unfolding on their massive screens. The sound penetrated the studio like a war cry, adding surreal intensity to what was happening inside. 20,000 voices merged into a single entity, demanding confrontation, craving spectacle. But Chuck seemed immune to the external pressure. His movement continued with the same measured pace, neither hurried nor hesitant. When he finally stopped, he stood perhaps 6 feet from Shaq, close enough that the size difference was stark, far enough that no one could claim aggression, but somehow occupying the space between them as if it belonged to him. Kenny had pressed himself back in his chair, his usual commentary completely silenced. The man who had instigated thousands of playful moments over the years suddenly found himself wishing he had never opened his mouth. The jovial energy he'd helped create felt dangerous now, like a campfire that had spread beyond its ring of stones. Barkley, whose street-smart instincts had been warning him since commercial break, made a decision. "Y'all," he said firmly, addressing both men, but focusing his attention on Shaq. "Maybe we should get back to talking about basketball." His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough confrontations to know when things were about to cross a line. But the arena crowd's energy was infectious, seeping through the studio walls and feeding something primal in both men. Shaq's competitive instincts, honed through decades of athletic dominance, detected something in Chuck's controlled approach that felt like the ultimate challenge. Not the theatrical challenges of his playing career, but something deeper and more personal. "You know what, Chuck?" Shaq said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to match the crowd's energy. "You're right about technique being important. But basketball taught me something too. Sometimes you gotta use what you got." He gestured at his massive frame, the movement exaggerated by nervousness. 71 and 300 lb has worked pretty well for me." Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying Shaq with the calm attention of someone reading a very interesting book. His response, when it came, carried the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "Size is definitely an advantage, Shaq. No question about that. But every advantage can become a weakness if you depend on it too much." The way he said it, not boastful, not challenging, just matter of fact, sent a visible chill through the studio. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't bragging. It was an observation delivered by someone who understood things the rest of them didn't. Spoken with the confidence that comes from decades of testing theories under extreme conditions, Devin's camera work had become instinctive, his film school training taking over as he captured the subtle interplay of expression and posture. Through his lens, he could see Shaq's confidence beginning to waver, not obviously, but in tiny tells that the camera picked up a slight tension in his jaw. The way his hands opened and closed unconsciously, the almost imperceptible backward lean that suggested his body was recognizing something his mind hadn't fully processed. Meanwhile, Chuck seemed to grow more centered with each passing second. Not aggressive, not threatening, but radiating a quality of presence that filled the space around him. The contrast was stark and undeniable, and everyone watching could feel it. That Shaq started to say, then stopped as Chuck took another step forward. This movement was different from the others, more deliberate, more purposeful. The distance between the two men had shrunk to perhaps 3 feet, close enough that Shaq had to look down to maintain eye contact. Close enough that the studio's hot lights seemed to focus on their confrontation like spotlights on a theater stage. "What are you doing, Chuck?" Shaq asked, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of genuine uncertainty. The playful giant who had dominated NBA courts through sheer physical presence found himself in uncharted territory. The arena crowd sensed the shift. Their chants became more urgent, more demanding. "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck." But there was something different in their energy now. Not just excitement, but recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Chuck's answer was barely above a whisper, but the studio microphones picked up every word with crystalline clarity. "I'm not doing anything, Shaq. I'm just being present." The phrase hit the studio like a revelation. Not aggressive, not threatening, just an explanation of what true presence looked like when stripped of pretense and performance. Chuck stood there smaller, older, seemingly vulnerable by every conventional measure, yet somehow radiating an authority that made Shaq's physical advantages feel suddenly irrelevant. And in that moment, with millions watching, with 20,000 people chanting, with the bright lights of live television bearing down on them, the TNT studio had been transformed into something far more significant than a sports broadcast. It had become a classroom where the most important lesson wasn't about basketball, but about the difference between having power and understanding it. The single step Chuck took seemed to compress the entire studio. What had been 6 ft of space between them now felt like inches, though Chuck remained well outside any normal conception of personal space. But proximity had nothing to do with what was happening. The martial artist's presence had expanded to fill the room in a way that made Shaq's impressive physical dimensions suddenly seem irrelevant. "All right then," Shaq said, his voice carrying forced enthusiasm as he raised his hands in what looked like a boxing stance. "Let's see what you got, Chuck." He shadowboxed lightly, trying to inject playfulness back into the moment. "Come on, show me some of those moves." For educational purposes, the arena crowd exploded. 20,000 voices merged into a thunderous roar that penetrated the studio walls and rattled the very foundations of the building. On giant screens throughout the arena, fans watched the confrontation unfold, their excitement building to fever pitch. But Chuck didn't match Shaq's energy. Instead, he simply adjusted his footing. A movement so subtle that cameras barely caught it, but one that fundamentally changed his presence in the space. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, his expression calm, but something about his posture suggested coiled potential energy. Kenny tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. "Oh man, this is really happening. Chuck, you gonna throw some kicks?" "Show us that Texas Ranger action, Kenny," Barkley said sharply, his voice cutting through the nervous energy. "Shut up." The words came out harder than intended. But Charles had seen enough street confrontations to recognize when playful banter crossed into something real. "Shaq, maybe we should." "Nah, Charles, it's cool," Shaq interrupted. But his shadowboxing had become more aggressive, more insistent. The crowd's energy was feeding something in him. Pride, competitiveness, the need to maintain his image as the dominant presence. "Chuck wants to talk about physics and respect. Let's see how it plays out." Maya's production truck was screaming in her earpiece, demanding she cut to commercial. But she found herself paralyzed by the unfolding drama. This wasn't television anymore. It was anthropology. Two different concepts of power meeting in real time, broadcast live to millions. Devin's camera captured everything, Shaq's movements growing more exaggerated as he tried to maintain control of the moment. Chuck's supernatural stillness as he absorbed and evaluated, the other analysts backing away almost unconsciously. The young camera operator had stumbled into documenting something extraordinary. "You know what your problem is, Chuck?" Shaq continued, his voice rising slightly as he threw more elaborate punches at empty air. "You're thinking too much. Sometimes you just gotta go with what works." He gestured at his massive frame. "This has worked pretty well for me." Chuck watched the display with the patience of someone observing a natural phenomenon. When he finally spoke, his voice seemed to come from a place of deeper calm than before. "Size is an advantage, Shaq. No question. But it can also be a weakness." The way he said it, not boastful, not challenging, just matter of fact, sent a chill through the studio. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation delivered by someone who understood things the rest of them didn't. Shaq stopped shadowboxing. For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered across his features before pride reasserted itself. "Weakness, man. Come on. I'm 7-1, 300 lb. I've been in playoff battles with the biggest, strongest dudes in the world, and I respect that," Chuck replied. "But you're thinking about basketball. This isn't basketball." The arena crowd had reached a crescendo that was almost deafening. Their chants had evolved beyond words into pure sound. The roar of 20,000 people. Sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, Ernie made a desperate attempt to regain control. "Guys, we really should move on too." But Chuck took another step forward, and the sentence died in Ernie's throat. This step was different from the others, more deliberate, more purposeful. The distance between the two men had shrunk to perhaps 3 feet, close enough that Shaq had to look down to maintain eye contact. "Chuck," Shaq said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of genuine uncertainty. "What are you doing, man?" Chuck's answer was barely above a whisper, but the studio microphones picked up every word. "I'm not doing anything, Shaq. I'm just being." The phrase hit like a revelation. Not aggressive, not threatening, just presence in its purest form. Chuck stood there, smaller, older, seemingly vulnerable, yet somehow radiating an authority that made Shaq's physical advantages feel irrelevant. Barkley had backed his chair completely away from the desk. "Oh, hell no," he muttered loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I've seen this before. Somebody's about to learn something they don't want to know." Maya finally found her voice. 30 seconds to commercial, but her announcement sounded desperate and meaningless in the face of what was unfolding. Devin's hands had begun to shake slightly as he operated his camera. His film school professors had talked about capturing authentic human moments, but this was beyond anything they'd described. This was primal. This was real. This was two men representing completely different understandings of power, meeting in the most public forum possible. Through the glass walls, the crowd had begun chanting something new. Fight, fight, fight. But their energy felt almost secondary now to the psychological drama playing out in the studio. Shaq looked down at Chuck, his breathing slightly elevated, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching respect mixed with weariness. "All right, Chuck, I hear you. You made your point." But Chuck hadn't moved. He stood in that same relaxed yet alert posture, close enough to touch Shaq, but radiating such control that the idea of physical contact seemed both impossible and unnecessary. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from a place of teaching rather than confrontation. "The point isn't mine to make, Shaq. It's yours to understand." And in that moment, with millions watching, with 20,000 people chanting, with the bright lights of live television bearing down on them, something fundamental shifted in the TNT studio. The confrontation had reached its peak, not through violence or aggression, but through the simple, undeniable demonstration of what real presence looked like. Shaq's hands slowly dropped to his sides as the lesson began to sink in. The studio had become a cathedral of tension, a sacred space where 20,000 voices beyond the glass walls had faded to a whisper, as if the entire arena sensed that something profound was happening in the intimate circle where two men stood facing each other. The bright television lights seemed to dim around Chuck and Shaq, creating an almost ethereal bubble where understanding was about to dawn like sunrise after the longest night. The air itself felt different, thicker, more charged, as if the very molecules had rearranged themselves to accommodate the weight of what was transpiring. Every person in the studio could feel it. Camera operators, sound technicians, production assistants, even the security guards who had been called but now stood frozen at the studio's periphery, unsure whether their presence was needed or if they were witnessing something that transcended their understanding of conflict resolution. Shaq looked down at the smaller man before him, his massive hands hanging at his sides like great pendulums that had finally stopped swinging. The shadow boxing had ceased. The bravado had evaporated like morning mist. In its place was something he hadn't felt since childhood. The humbling recognition that someone in the room understood things he didn't. Possessed knowledge that made his physical advantages feel suddenly irrelevant. His breathing had slowed, becoming more deliberate, as if each inhalation was helping him process not just oxygen, but revelation. The 7'1" frame that had intimidated NBA, centers and dominated basketball courts now seemed less like a weapon and more like simply the body he happened to inhabit. Impressive, certainly, but no longer the defining characteristic of his presence in this space. "Chuck," Shaq said quietly. his voice stripped of performance and pretense, carrying none of the theatrical energy that had filled the studio moments before. "I think I'm starting to get it now." The words came out with the tentative quality of someone testing new understanding, like a student who had glimpsed the solution to a complex problem, but wasn't entirely sure he could articulate it yet. His usual booming confidence had been replaced by something more vulnerable and paradoxically more genuine. Chuck's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not relief, not triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had delivered a lesson without having to destroy anyone in the process. His posture remained alert, but relaxed, like a teacher who had guided a student through a difficult concept and was now waiting to see if the understanding would take root. "What do you get, Shaq?" Chuck asked, his voice carrying gentle curiosity rather than challenge. There was no condescension in the question, no suggestion that Shaq should have understood sooner, just genuine interest in hearing what the younger man had learned from their encounter. The arena crowd, watching on massive screens throughout the viewing area, began to sense the shift in energy like animals detecting an approaching storm. The blood-hungry chants for violence began to fade, replaced by something more respectful, more reverent. 20,000 people who had come expecting spectacle were witnessing something far more valuable. The moment when ego surrenders to wisdom without losing dignity in the process. Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Chuck's face as he searched for the words to express what was crystallizing in his mind. He gestured vaguely at the space between them, his massive hands moving slowly, carefully, was never about fighting at all. The realization seemed to surprise him even as he spoke it. His voice carried the wonder of someone discovering that what he thought was one thing had actually been something else entirely. The confrontation he had been preparing for, the physical challenge he had been building toward, had been transformed into something completely different without him even realizing when the transition had occurred. It was about... Shaq paused, his brow furrowing as he worked through the implications. About understanding different kinds of strength, about recognizing that what works in one situation might not work in another, about respect that doesn't come from intimidation. Chuck nodded slowly, his approval evident not in words, but in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "And what else do you understand now?" The question invited deeper reflection, encouraged Shaq to continue, exploring the lesson that was unfolding in real time. It was the kind of prompting that great teachers use, not giving answers directly, but guiding students toward discoveries they needed to make for themselves. Shaq's response came after a long pause, his voice carrying newfound humility. "That I've been confusing having power with understanding power. That there's a difference between being strong and being wise. That the loudest person in the room..." He trailed off, remembering Chuck's earlier words, then continued with a rueful smile usually isn't the strongest. The arena crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, not the wild, bloodthirsty cheering they had been generating before, but something deeper and more meaningful. 20,000 people who had come expecting entertainment had witnessed something more valuable. Two men resolving conflict through understanding rather than violence, strength revealing itself through restraint rather than force. Barkley, from his safe distance, exhaled loudly with visible relief. "Thank God," he muttered, his voice carrying gratitude mixed with amazement. "I was about to call my insurance company and update my will." The comic relief was perfectly timed, breaking some of the tension while allowing the profound moment to settle into something more manageable. Charles had spent his career knowing when to lighten the mood, and his instincts told him This was the moment when everyone needed to breathe again. Kenny found his voice again, but it came out subdued, thoughtful, stripped of his usual energetic commentary. "Man, Chuck, you just schooled all of us without throwing a punch, without even raising your voice. That's incredible." His words carried genuine admiration mixed with a new understanding of what he had witnessed. Kenny had spent his career around athletes who expressed dominance through physical achievement. But he had just seen a different kind of mastery entirely. The ability to control a situation through presence and wisdom rather than force. Chuck turned his head slightly toward Kenny, his eyes holding a hint of warmth that hadn't been there during the confrontation. The best lessons usually work that way. "Kenny, when people are ready to learn, you don't need to force understanding on them. You just need to create the conditions where they can discover it for themselves." The words carried the wisdom of someone who had spent decades not just learning martial arts, but understanding the philosophy behind them. Chuck had demonstrated something that went far beyond physical technique. He had shown how true mastery involved knowing when not to use your skills, when restraint was more powerful than action. Devin's camera captured the exact moment when Shaq took a deliberate step backward, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement. The movement was slow, purposeful, filled with respect rather than defeat. The massive NBA legend was creating space not out of fear, but out of recognition for what he had just experienced and learned. Maya, watching from behind her monitors, felt unexpected tears welling up in her eyes. In 20 years of television production, she had managed countless shows, dealt with celebrity egos, technical disasters, and every conceivable crisis that could befall a live broadcast. But she had never seen anything like this. Raw human drama giving way to genuine growth. Conflict transforming into connection, all happening in real time in front of millions of viewers. Her headset crackled with excited voices from the production truck. The ratings were through the roof. Social media was exploding with clips and commentary. Network executives were already talking about follow-up segments, special episodes, the kind of content that could define a network's programming for months to come. But Maya wasn't thinking about ratings or programming. She was processing the fact that her studio had just become the setting for something extraordinary. A masterclass in human dignity broadcast live to the world. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Shaq said, shaking his head with genuine amazement, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and self-reflection. "I can bench press 400 lb. I've posterized the biggest players in NBA history. I've dominated physically my entire life, and I've never felt more outmatched than I do right now." The admission came with no shame, no embarrassment, just honest recognition of having encountered something beyond his previous experience. Shaq's willingness to acknowledge his humbling was perhaps more impressive than any physical feat he had accomplished in his athletic career. Chuck's response came with the slightest smile, the first genuine expression of warmth he had shown all evening. A subtle acknowledgement that the lesson had been received and understood. "You weren't outmatched, Shaq. You were learning. There's a difference between being defeated and being educated." The distinction was crucial, and everyone in the studio understood its importance. Chuck had carefully avoided humiliating Shaq, instead guiding him toward understanding without stripping away his dignity. It was the difference between a bully demonstrating superiority and a teacher sharing wisdom. Ernie seized the 34th moment to guide them back towards something approaching normally. His broadcaster's instincts telling him that this was the perfect time to transition. "Chuck, what you just demonstrated this understanding of strength through restraint. Is that what you mean when you talk about mental discipline in high-pressure situations?" The question allowed everyone to step back from the personal confrontation and examine its broader implications. Ernie was providing a bridge between the raw human drama they had just witnessed and the kind of analysis their audience expected from a sports broadcast. "Part of it," Chuck replied, finally moving away from Shaq and toward his chair. But even in this retreat, his movement remained controlled and purposeful. There was no hurry, no relief, just the natural conclusion of a lesson that had reached its appropriate end. Real mental discipline, Chuck continued as he settled back into his seat with the same fluid grace he had displayed throughout the wand. Evening comes from understanding yourself well enough that you don't need to prove anything to anyone else. When you know who you are and what you're capable of, you can choose your battles. You can recognize when fighting would be pointless, when walking away is the stronger choice, when sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Shaq remained standing for a moment longer, processing not just Chuck's words, but the entire experience they had just shared. When he finally sat down, his entire demeanor had changed. The playful giant was still there, but underneath it was something deeper now. Humility earned through experience rather than imposed by circumstance. The change was visible in his posture, the way he carried himself, still confident, still impressive, but tempered now with awareness of his limitations and respect for other kinds of strength. It was the posture of someone who had learned something important about himself and was still integrating that knowledge. "Chuck," Shaq said, his voice carrying newfound sincerity that resonated through the studio. "I want to apologize if I disrespected you earlier. That wasn't my intention. But I'm learning that impact matters more than intention." The apology was genuine, carrying none of the performative quality that often characterized public acknowledgments of error. Shaq had clearly thought about not just what had happened, but why it had happened and what he could learn from it. The arena crowd erupted again, their applause now carrying a different quality. Appreciation for growth, respect for wisdom, celebration of two men finding common ground through understanding rather than dominance. The sound penetrated the studio like a benediction, blessing the resolution they had just witnessed. "No apology necessary, Shaq," Chuck replied, his tone warm and accepting. "You weren't disrespecting me. You were being authentic to who you are. That's never something to apologize for. Tonight, you just learned that there are different ways to express that authenticity, different situations that call for different approaches." The grace in Chuck's response elevated the moment even further. He had avoided the temptation to accept Shaq's apology in a way that suggested wrongdoing. Instead, reframing the entire encounter as a learning experience that reflected well on both participants. Barkley, ever the comedian, but now with genuine appreciation for what he had witnessed, couldn't resist one more observation. "Chuck, remind me never to joke about your height again. I may be dumb, but I ain't stupid." The studio erupted in laughter. Real laughter this time, born of relief and genuine affection rather than nervous energy. The tension that had gripped the room for the past 30 minutes dissolved like morning fog, replaced by something warmer and more comfortable. But the laughter didn't diminish the significance of what had transpired. If anything, it highlighted how thoroughly Chuck had transformed a potentially destructive situation into something constructive. The ability to maintain dignity while learning humility, to find humor while processing serious lessons. These were the marks of genuine resolution. Kenny, emboldened by the return to normalcy and still processing what he had witnessed, found the courage to ask the question that was probably on every viewer's mind. "Chuck, what's the biggest lesson you think we can all take from what just happened here?" Chuck considered the question carefully, his response carrying the weight of someone who understood that millions of people were listening and that his words might influence how they handled conflict in their own lives. "That respect isn't something you demand or take," he said finally. "It's something you earn through your actions, your choices, your character. And once you truly have it, respect from others. But more importantly, respect for yourself. You never have to ask for it again. It becomes part of who you are, and it influences every interaction you have." The lesson resonated through the studio and beyond, into homes and sports bars and gathering places across America where people had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just entertainment, but education. Not just conflict, but resolution. Not just drama, but growth. As the moment settled into its natural conclusion, everyone in the studio understood that they had been part of something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. They had witnessed two legends, one representing overwhelming physical presence, the other embodying controlled discipline, find a way to transform potential destruction into mutual understanding. And in doing so, they had demonstrated to the world that the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from helping them discover better versions of themselves. The TNT studio had returned to its familiar rhythm by the time credits rolled. But something fundamental had changed in the very DNA of the space. The red recording lights dimmed with their usual mechanical precision, and the broadcast officially ended with the same professional efficiency that had marked thousands of shows before it. Yet, the atmosphere that remained felt entirely different, quieter, more thoughtful, touched by the weight of what had just transpired in front of millions of viewers. The usual post-show energy was absent. Normally, the moment cameras stopped rolling, the studio would fill with chatter. Crew members rushing to break down equipment, analysts discussing what had worked and what hadn't. The kind of professional bustle that accompanies the end of any live television production. Instead, there was an almost reverent quiet, as if everyone present understood. They had been witnesses to something that transcended normal entertainment. Shaq remained in his chair for a long moment after the cameras stopped rolling, his massive frame somehow seeming less imposing than it had hours earlier. Not diminished exactly, but transformed like a mountain that had shifted its perspective to reveal previously hidden valleys and streams. His hands rested on the desk with newfound stillness, no longer drumming the restless rhythm of nervous energy that had marked the evening's earlier moments. The silence stretched for perhaps 30 seconds, an eternity in television time before Shaq finally spoke, his voice carrying none of the theatrical boom that usually filled the studio. Instead, his words came out with the careful consideration of someone who had just discovered that conversation could be as profound as any physical encounter. "Chuck," he said quietly, as crew members began their post-show cleanup around them with unusual discretion, moving with the careful quiet of librarians in a sacred space. "Can I ask you something?" Chuck nodded, his posture as relaxed as it had been throughout the evening, but his attention completely focused on the man who had challenged him. There was no trace of triumph in his bearing, no suggestion that he considered himself the victor of any kind of contest. Instead, he radiated the patient attention of someone genuinely interested in facilitating understanding. "How long did you know?" Shaq asked, leaning forward slightly with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. "I mean, from the moment I started joking around, how long did you know exactly how that was going to play out?" The question carried the weight of someone trying to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been possible. Shaq was accustomed to being able to read situations, to understand the dynamics of competition and confrontation through decades of athletic experience. But tonight had shown him that there were levels of awareness he hadn't even known existed. Chuck's smile was gentle, almost paternal, carrying the warmth of someone who appreciated honest inquiry. I didn't know how it would play out, Shaq. But I knew how it wouldn't. Which was with either of us getting hurt, Chuck replied simply. And I knew that if it did start to go in a direction where someone might get hurt, I had the tools to prevent that without causing more damage than necessary. The answer revealed layers of thinking that impressed everyone within earshot. Chuck hadn't been planning for victory or dominance. He had been prepared for de-escalation, for resolution, for the protection of everyone involved, including Shaq himself. Devin, still filming behind-the-scenes footage from a respectful distance, captured the exchange with the understanding that he was documenting something historic. The young camera operator had instinctively recognized the importance of preserving these quieter moments, the aftermath that often revealed as much truth as the dramatic confrontation itself. His footage would later become some of the most valuable content of his early career, not just because of its viral potential, but because it showed what genuine resolution looked like when two men with different approaches to strength found common ground through mutual respect. Meanwhile, Maya's phone had been buzzing incessantly since the broadcast ended. Her screen showed missed calls from network executives, ESPN producers, entertainment journalists, and social media managers, all clamoring for immediate follow-up content. Twitter was exploding with clips from the confrontation, and hashtags like #ChuckVShaq, #RealStrength, and #TNT Showdown were already trending nationwide. But Maya wasn't focused on the media circus building outside their studio walls. She was watching Chuck and Shaq continue their conversation with the fascination of someone witnessing authentic human connection form in real time. In 20 years of television production, she had rarely seen anything so genuine emerge from the controlled chaos of live broadcasting. "You know what's really getting to me?" Shaq continued, his voice carrying the wonder of someone processing a revelation in real time. "I've spent my whole career being the biggest guy in the room, using that as my primary advantage. And tonight, I learned that there are situations where that advantage might actually work against me." Chuck nodded thoughtfully. Size, strength, speed, they're all tools. But like any tool, they're only as effective as the person using them understands how to apply them appropriately. "And you knew that I didn't understand?" Shaq said, not as an accusation, but as recognition of a lesson learned. "I knew that you were thinking about this like a basketball situation," Chuck replied. "In basketball, size and strength are almost always advantages. But we weren't playing basketball." The distinction resonated through the studio, where other conversations had gradually quieted as crew members and analysts found themselves drawn into the philosophical discussion unfolding between the two men. Barkley approached the pair, his usual comedic energy tempered by genuine respect and curiosity. The man, who had made a career out of saying exactly what he thought, found himself choosing his words more carefully than usual. "Chuck," he said, settling into a nearby chair, "I got to ask, and I hope this doesn't sound stupid, but was there ever a moment where you thought about actually, showing what you could do, like physically demonstrating instead of just standing there?" It was the question many viewers were probably thinking, but didn't know how to ask. Barkley's street-smart honesty made him the perfect person to voice what others might have considered too crude or direct to express. Chuck considered the question seriously, giving it the respect that Barkley's genuine curiosity deserved. "There was a moment," he admitted, "when I could see that words alone weren't going to be enough to communicate what I was trying to share. But even then, demonstration doesn't have to mean domination." "What do you mean?" Kenny asked, joining the conversation with an energy that was more subdued than his usual commentary style, but no less engaged. The most powerful demonstration of strength, Chuck explained, is often restraint. When someone realizes that you could do something but are choosing not to, it creates a different kind of understanding than if you actually did it. Ernie, ever the thoughtful host, found himself genuinely curious about the psychological dynamics he had just witnessed. Chuck, you've obviously dealt with confrontations before. How do you read a situation to know when that kind of approach will work? Chuck's response revealed the depth of thought that went into what appeared to be natural instincts. Experience teaches you to recognize when someone is looking for a real fight versus when they're looking for validation or trying to maintain their image. Shaq wasn't looking for violence. He was looking for respect and trying to maintain his position as the dominant presence. Once I understood that, I could work with it instead of against it. The analysis impressed everyone listening. Chuck had been conducting a real-time psychological assessment while managing his own response to escalating pressure, all while millions watched and judged every reaction. So, you were basically doing conflict resolution therapy on live television. Maya observed from her position near the monitors, her director's perspective allowing her to see the encounter from yet another angle. Chuck laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound he had made all evening. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I suppose that's not entirely wrong. Good conflict resolution usually involves helping everyone involved understand what they actually want versus what they think they want. Shaq shook his head with continuing amazement. Man, you were treating this like a chess game while I was playing checkers, not chess. Chuck corrected gently. More like Aikido. The goal isn't to win, it's to redirect energy in a way that serves everyone involved. The conversation was drawing in more participants as crew members and production staff found excuses to linger within earshot. What had begun as a post-show debrief between two participants had evolved into an impromptu masterclass in human psychology, conflict resolution, and different approaches to personal strength. Young Devon found himself thinking about the footage he had captured and how it might be used. This wasn't just behind-the-scenes content anymore. It was documentary material that revealed how genuine learning happened when people felt safe enough to be vulnerable about their mistakes. Chuck, Shaq said, his tone becoming more serious. I want to apologize not just for tonight, but for thinking I had you figured out before we even met. I walked in here with assumptions about who you were based on movies and stories, and I treated you like a character instead of a person. The apology went deeper than what had happened during the broadcast, touching on the kind of prejudgment that often occurs when celebrities encounter each other through the filter of their public personas. Chuck's response was immediate and gracious. Shaq, we all make assumptions based on limited information. That's human nature. The important thing is what you do when you get more complete information. And what did I do right? Shaq asked, genuinely curious about his own behavior from Chuck's perspective. You stayed open to learning, Chuck replied. When you realized that your usual approach wasn't working, instead of doubling down or getting angry, you started asking different questions. That takes courage. The observation highlighted something that might have been missed in all the analysis of the confrontation. Shaq's willingness to adapt when faced with new information had been just as important to the interior. Positive resolution as Chuck's disciplined restraint. Barkley, never one to let a moment get too serious without some levity, couldn't resist adding his perspective. Plus, Shaq, you managed to get schooled on national television without completely embarrassing yourself. That's got to count for something. The studio erupted in laughter, genuine, warm laughter that felt like the final release of all the tension that had been building throughout the evening. But even the humor carried respect, acknowledging the difficulty of what Shaq had navigated. As the conversation continued, Maya noticed something remarkable happening on her social media feeds. While clips of the confrontation were indeed going viral, the comments weren't focused on who had won or lost. Instead, people were sharing quotes from the resolution, discussing the lessons about respect and strength, analyzing the difference between confidence and ego. The hashtag #strength was being used not to mock either participant, but to share stories about times when people had chosen restraint over retaliation, understanding over dominance. The encounter had sparked a broader conversation about masculinity, power, and the various ways strength could be expressed. Maya, her assistant, called from across the studio. "We're getting interview requests from everyone. TMZ, ESPN, Joe Rogan, even some psychology podcasts want to talk about what happened tonight." But Maya was watching Chuck work the room, taking time with every crew member who approached him for photos, autographs, or just conversation. He treated each interaction with the same patient attention he had given to the on-air situation, as if every person's experience mattered equally. "You know what's impressive about Chuck?" Kenny observed, following Mia's gaze. "He's not treating what happened like a victory lap. He's treating it like, I don't know, like it was just another day at the office, because for him, it probably was." Ernie replied thoughtfully, "I'm guessing conflict resolution is just a normal part of how he moves through the world." The observation sparked another round of reflection about the difference between people who occasionally have to deal with conflict and people who have developed systematic approaches to handling it constructively. As the evening wound down and crew members began the more serious work of breaking down the set, Chuck approached Shaq one final time. The conversation that followed was quiet enough that only those immediately nearby could hear it. But Devin's camera captured the body language. Two men who had started the evening as strangers and potential adversaries, ending it with the kind of mutual respect that could form the foundation of genuine friendship. "Shaq," Chuck said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened tonight doesn't define you. How you handle what you learned from it, that's what will matter in the long run." Shaq's response was equally quiet, but carried deep gratitude. "Chuck, I feel like I learned more about myself in the last hour than I have in years. That's a gift I won't forget." They shook hands, Chuck's compact grip meeting Shaq's massive palm, and the image would later become one of the most shared photos from the entire encounter. Not because it was dramatic or confrontational, but because it represented resolution, growth, and the kind of mutual respect that seemed increasingly rare in public discourse. As Chuck finally prepared to leave the studio, members of the crew approached him with their own questions and observations. Maya congratulated him on what she called the best television I've ever been part of producing. Devin thanked him for allowing the behind-the-scenes documentation and mentioned his hope that the footage might help other people understand how conflicts could be resolved constructively. Even the security guards, who had been called during the confrontation but never needed to intervene, approached Chuck to express their appreciation for how he had handled the situation. One mentioned that he would be sharing the story with his teenage son as an example of how real strength operated. Chuck, Maya said, as he neared the exit, "I know you're probably going to be flooded with interview requests and appearance opportunities after tonight. But if you ever want to come back just to talk, no confrontation, no drama, just conversation, you'll always be welcome here." Chuck's smile carried genuine warmth as he thanked her for the invitation. "Maya, what happened tonight happened because you and your team created a space where authentic interaction was possible. That's rarer than you might think." As Chuck disappeared into the Atlanta evening, the TNT studio slowly returned to its normal post-bro routine. But the crew members who had witnessed what happened would carry the memory for the rest of their careers. They had seen how real strength operated not through force or intimidation, but through presence, wisdom, and the confidence that comes from truly understanding yourself and your capabilities. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.